Okay, we got up to Yosef Rabbi Yaakov here on Daf Samachtes Omid Aleph, and it's in the wide lines, and we'll see it approximately 5 lines down, something like that. Yosef Rabbi Yaakov Minahar Kod Kami Deravina. Now we're talking about the question of what's called Hukar Ha'ubra, which means that the assumption of the Gemara was that a woman would show after 3 months. So it's from conception. If we count 3 months, that's called Hukar Ha'ubra. At that point, we know that we can determine, we can see, and it's obvious that she's pregnant. So again, we're in the wide lines on Daf Samachtes Amud Aleph, and we're counting down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down. Yosef Rabbi Yaakov Minar Kod Kami Deravina. The Yosef v'Ka'amar Mishmei Derav Huna Brei Derav Yoshua Shmamina Miderav Kruspedoi Omar Rav Shabtai. From this statement that after 3 months from the time of Havash de Saros, he's no longer a candidate as a Ben Soru Mora to become a Ben Soru Mora. Hayoledes l'shiva, if a woman gives birth prematurely after 7 months of pregnancy, Ein ubra nikar l'shlish yomel. So it means we're talking about 2 months and a third. And he says the following, that she'll give birth after 7 months of pregnancy. And the ubar itself is not nikar l'shlish yomel. As we said, 2 months and a third, because you multiply 2 1/3 months by 3, you get 7 months. So even though 1/3 of her pregnancy has passed by, in this case of a premature birth, nevertheless, she will not show. It's not hukara uba. We have to wait a full 3 months, which is much more than 1/3 of her pregnancy in the case of a 7-month baby, in order to reach the point of hukara uba. If you're going to just take the number of months until she gives birth from conception and divide it into 3, and each part is 1/3, which would mean that she should have hukar ubar after 2 months and a third, then lama lishlosha chadashim. Why did Rav Kruspedoi say that he can only become a Ben Sor Mora for maximum up to 3 months from the day that he shows his 2 saras? V'treva til sasagi. It should be enough that we wait 2 months and a third, and then he's already being parted from Ben Sor Mora. He can't get punished because it's possible that he could have a relationship with a woman after he had shtei saros. She became pregnant, and maybe she'll give birth after 7 months for a premature baby. And after a third of those 7 months, we'll have hukar ubar. We'll be able to tell that she's pregnant. And therefore, he's royally kroso. That was the essence of Rav Kruspedoi. But yet Rav Kruspedoi said that he can only become a Ben Sor Morer after 3 months. It must be that this principle of hukar ubar is always set at 3 months, no matter when she gives birth, whether she carries to the full term of 9 months or she gives birth premature. Amalei, so Ravina responds to Rav Yaakov. Really, in truth, a woman will show after 1/3 of her pregnancy. And if it's a 7-month pregnancy, she'll show after 2 months and a third. So nevertheless, Zil Basar Ruba, we're going to go by Rove. Rove women give birth after 9 months of pregnancy, and they carry to the full term. And therefore, she's only Hukara Ubar after 3 months, which is 1/3 of her pregnancy. And therefore, it's Ein Roy Likroso Av in less than 3 months. So now what we're doing is we are operating within the framework of Rove. And based on the halach of Rove, we're going to establish that the Ptur of Ben Sorah Morer will apply after 3 months, even though in the miut of cases, he may have impregnated a woman after having shtei saros, and she gave birth prematurely, and therefore he was royally kroso av already after 2 months and a third. But no, we're going to establish his candidacy as a ben sorah throughout the 3 months based on Rove. Now it's interesting because if not for the principle of Rove, if we can consider the possibility, let's say, call it 30%, 20%, whatever percentage of women give birth after 7 months, then he's already out of the picture. He's no longer a candidate to be a ben sorah more after 2 months and a third. And we're going to save his life, basically. But no, we're not going to save his life. We're going to assume that the woman that he impregnated is going to carry the full term like Rove. And based on that, we're going to put him to death. Amru Kamei de Rav Huna Berei Rav Yeshua. They explained Ravina's. One second. Ravina was the one who made the original statement. No, I'm sorry. Rav Yaakov said the original statement. Ravina rejected it, and he said, "No, we're going Basar Rov." So based on Ravina, we don't pater up a ben sorah morer in less than this period of 3 months because we're going to rely on Rov. Amalahu. So Rav Huda responded when he heard this chiddush, this insight, and this ruling of Ravina, and he said, "Bebina fashus mi azlina basaruba." Can you put a person to death based on Rov? HaTorah Amra, v'shaftu ha'eda v'tzilu ha'eda. With regard to a rotzeach, in Bamidbar Lamed Hey, the Torah tells us that we are obligated to v'tzilu ha'eda. That when Bezdin, the Sanhedrin, judges someone in a murder case, a murder crime, and we have to determine whether or not he killed the Mazid or he killed the Shogeg, we have to look for a tzad schutz. We have to try to find in the nidon, the person who's on trial, some sort of schutz. We want to save him from Mises Bezdin. And we want to establish that perhaps he was a Shogeg and he wasn't a deliberate murderer. So here too, and again, in the case of Ben Sorah Morer, we have a way of Yitzilued, of a tzad schus, to say that maybe he already leaves the status of Ben Sorah Morer, the candidacy as a Ben Sorah Morer, after 2 months and a third from the moment that he had shtei saras, because he already roy lios av in a case of a premature birth of 7 months. The at amrit zil basaruba. How can you say that we're going to put him to death by assuming that, like the Rove, the woman that he impregnated will carry a full term of 9 months, and therefore he still has candidacy for 3 months, and only after the 3 months he becomes royal likro av, lios av? Would we rely on Rove when the Torah says v'tzilu ha'eda? We want to save the life of the nidon, who in this case the ben sorah morer would be put to death if we judge it based on rov, when we should be choshesh, we should have compassion on him, and save him based on the mute, based on the fact that maybe perhaps this woman would give birth prematurely. Okay, now I know that, John, you have the Masifta. So what I want you to do is take a look here at He'ara number Yud Zayin. And he quotes the Ran. This Gemara that we're learning here in Sanhedrin would seem at the face of it to contradict a Gemara in Chulin on Daf Yud Aleph on the base. Because that sugya seems to assume and prove that on a Deraisa level, we do rely on rov. Because when a Rotzeach is found guilty of murder, we put him to death, and we're not afraid that maybe, perhaps, the victim of the murder was a treifa. Maybe he was about to die anyway. So the answer is, says the Gemara, because the Torah relies on rov, and we're going to put the murderer to death as a murderer based on the rov. So how could the Amoraim here in our sugya, asks Iran, try to say that we cannot use rov in Bini Nefashim, but rather we have to consider the minority cases, the mute, in order to save Yitzilu Eda, the Nidon, from capital punishment. The Gemara says that we're going to assume that the Rotzeh killed a Bari and not a treifa, and therefore we're going to put him to death based on rov. So you see that rov is enough to put someone to death. And basically, in the light of the Gemara in Chulin, this whole diun, this whole discussion in the Gemara, can we put the Ben Sorah to death based on an assumption of rov? Can we not? It's explicit in the Gemara in Chulin that the Torah relies on rov, even if it means putting someone to death. So the Ran comes up with a new principle here. It's not always the case that we rely on rov and put someone to death based on rov. But rather that only applies in the following category. Kishe'ein efshoris levar klal. When there's no possibility of clarifying, then we fall back on rov, even if it means putting someone to death. So we can never really know for sure, 100%, that the victim of this murder was a bari, lest perhaps he was a treifa. So why do we rely on rov to put him to death? Because there's no possibility of clarifying whether or not the victim was a treifa. And the Torah says, put the murderer to death. How can the Torah say, put the murderer to death? Maybe he killed a treifa. But the answer is that the very fact that the Torah condemns a murderer to death, that proves that we have a halach of rov, that we rely on rov, but only in a case where there's no other possibility of clarifying the rov. Here in our sugya, we can put the Ben Sorah Umara to death even without relying on rov, by reducing the time period to 2 months and a third. We could be mekayim the pasuk of Yitzilu Eda, but yet we could be mekayim the din of hariga. and we can put the Ben Sora to death. So the question is, how long of a period of time is there a candidacy to put the Ben Sora to death? Is it 2 months and a third or a full 3 months? Okay, here we're going to say that we don't rely on Rove, according to that opinion. But we're not being oker, we're not undermining and ripping out from the Torah the whole parsha of Ben Sora Mor that he's condemned to death. We're dealing with specifics. But in the case of treifa, meaning is the victim of the murder a treifa or not, you're not dealing with specifics. You're dealing with every single case of a murderer. And if you're going to be choshesh for the miut that maybe the victim was a treifa, then you're going to rip out and undermine the entire application of the parsha v'tzicha, of putting to death a rotzeach. So let me read to you the language of the Ran. V'im tomar v'beperakama d'chulin yalfina midini nefashis tazlinin basa ruba mishum delo chayshin dilma treipahara yeshlama dehasa mayri hechadi efshal lemivdika laharuk. Right, we cannot check out the body of the victim. You know, even if you do a post-mortem surgery, you won't be able to determine whether he was a treifa or not. Why? Because Chayshina l'neimar shema b'makom nekev having. Maybe he had an internal puncture of one of his vital organs exactly where he was killed. V'chaygav l'keva d'yom rachmona d'niktal rotzeach al karchach svirlon nazlina basaruba the inshi the law of treifa. So the fact that Torah says we put the murderer to death, we derive the conclusion that the Torah relies on Rove that a person is not a treifa. But that only applies in the suffix treifa, where we have no way of clarifying. In a case where, even if you're worried about the mute, we can still be makayim the din. Kigon zel, like here in the case of Ben Sora Mor, she'efshi sheyeh roy lekroso av. It became in sheshah shanim, shnayim chadoshim, or gimel chadoshim, shehevi shtei saros. It's hainu the makshinon, v'v'shaftu eda v'tzilu ha'eda. So we could, in certain circumstances, be choshesh for the miyut, and in certain circumstances, we could pater him up. Like, for example, after 2 months and a third. But in other situations, where let's say he was a Ben Sora Mor before the 2 months and a third passed by, so he's not, we can already establish at that time that for sure he's not yet royally krosoah, even if she would give birth prematurely. So I think what he's saying here, the Ran, is that you could have your cake and eat it, meaning you can have both. You can have shashlamiyut, and still you could be makayim the mitzvah, right? Shashlamiyut, and therefore fulfill the shavtu ha'eda. But we can still salvage the parsha of Ben Sor Moreh and put the Ben Sor Moreh to death within that more narrow period of time from Shtei Saras until 2 1/3 months. So again, for the sake of the Tzilu Ha'eda, we're going to cut down the period of time of candidacy for Ben Sor Moreh to be killed as Ben Sor Moreh to 2 months and 1/3, based on the miut of women who give birth prematurely after 7 months. What I'm trying to figure out is whether or not the Sugyan Chulin is actually relevant here. I mean, the Gemara Chulin establishes that we rely on rove and we put someone to death. But here we're talking about Roy Leos Ah. So at what point does he Roy Leos Ah? So the question is, can a miut establish a Roy Leos Ah? Because after he became a gadol and he had Shtei Saras, he impregnated a woman, and again, when it's Hukar Ubar, he's called Roy Leos Av, and it could be Hukar Ubar after 2 months and 1/3 if she gave birth prematurely, right? So we're going to say that when the Torah talks about Roy Leos Av, maybe Roy Leos Av is determined by the miut and not by the rove. I mean, that has nothing to do with, whether we put to death a murderer based on rove. We're just trying to figure out what's Roy Leos Av. Right, in the case of Ben Sor Moreh, we don't know for sure that he impregnated a woman, and yet after the 3-month period of time, says Rav Kuspadoy, we're going to exempt him from Ben Soru Mor, because he's already royal Lios Av. He had already 3 months since his Shtei Saras. So it's all a question of how to define royal Lios Av. And maybe we could say already after 2 months and a third, he's royal Lios Av. He could become a father if he impregnated after he had the 2 Saras. And there's already Hukar Uba. If you hold 1/3 of the entire pregnancy, and she gave birth after 7 months. So let's just see the Shakla V'Tarya of the Gemara now. Right, the Gemara says that Ravina's principle is difficult. Because since of Itzilua Eda, so we don't rely on Rov. And yet Ravina relies on Rov. So we don't know how to reconcile Ravina with the Tzilua Eda. Adrua Kameda Ravina. So whatever Rav Huna argued against Ravina, they brought back to the attention of Ravina. Omalei, so Ravina responds, Ubedine nefashos lo azlinan basa ruba. Meaning what? You're accusing me of ignoring the principle of Itzilua Eda. I'm going to prove to you that Rov overrides Itzilua Eda. But nan, right, so this is the part of Sanhedrin we didn't learn. A Mishnah on Daf Mem. And this has to do with Hakchasha, when you have 2 witnesses testifying, perhaps in a murder case, or in any event in a capital case, and there's a discrepancy between each one of the 2 Eidim. Can we reconcile that discrepancy? So Echad Omer, one of the 2 witnesses, claims that whatever happened took place Bishnai B'Chodesh, on the 2nd day of the month. The Echad Omer and the other witness says Bishlosha. It took place on the 3rd day of the month. And the Mishnah says, they do some kayemes. We're going to reconcile this contradiction. We're going to put the nidon to death. Shezeh yodeh bi'iburo shel chodesh, shezeh eini yodeh. Not everybody knows whether Bezdin decided that the month should be a month of 30 days or a month of 29 days. If it's a month of 30 days, then day 31 is going to be the first day of the month. If it's a month of 29 days, the day 30 will be the first day of the month. So let's say, for example, the witness that testified that the murder took place on the 2nd of the month, he was aware of the decision of Bezdin to be ma'aber the chodesh. But the one who said that the murder took place on the 3rd of the month, he was not aware that Bezdin was ma'aber the chodesh. And it seems that most people would not know the difference whether it was a me'ubar or not a me'ubar. They don't know whether Bezdin decided to add a day to the month. So let's say, according to the second witness who testified that it happened on the 3rd of the month, he thought that Rosh Chodesh was on the 30th of the month. So therefore, the murder took place on the 3rd of the month. Because the previous month was Chassid. Right. Now, if the Torah says Vitzilu Eda, and we have to be choshesh for the miut, Nema Hani Dafka Kovasade. Maybe both of these witnesses knew exactly when Bezdin was ma'aber the chodesh. And this is really a genuine hakasha. So we won't be able to put the nidon to death. He'll allow Mishum Damrin and Zil Basaruba. Baruba the Inshi Abdi the Tobi Bur Diarcha. We assume that people don't know when is Rosh Chodesh. Is it day 30 or day 31? And that's why we're going to reconcile these two witnesses and the discrepancy between their statements of 2nd or 3rd day of the month. And by reconciling these two, we're going to put the nidon to death based on Rov. Whereas in the case of Ben Sora Morer, we're going to put him to death after 2 and a 3rd months, since his Cyrus, up to 3 months, because we're going to rely on Rov. So Ravina says, I have a very good defense. I can prove my point that we rely on Rov to put a person to death. Because Rubenshi Abdi the Toy be Bur the Archa. So let's just think. Ravina could not prove his point based on a rotzeach. And we see that we rely on Rov that the victim of the murder was a bard. And the Ran says that that wouldn't have supported Ravina because that's a case of a Rov of Yev Shalavarer, and we would undermine the whole parsha of Rotzeach. So how does Ravina prove l'shitaso that we're going to rely on Rov from the case of Hakosha and Avis? And we're going to assume that most people are not aware of Ibra Chodesh. And therefore, we're going to explain this discrepancy between the two Eidim, whether it happened on the 2nd of the month or the 3rd of the month.
I mean, I understand they don't know if it was the 2nd or the 3rd, but they know which day of the week it is. So do they clarify it that way?
That's a good point. Maybe that's why we're able to rely on this road. But you see, there are 7 chakiros, 6 of which are about Zman. And we ask him what was the Shemitah, and what was the year of the Shemitah, and what was the month of that year, and what was the day of the month, etc., etc. So that even though we ask him the day of the week, we still need for him to tell us the day of the month. Now, here there's a discrepancy between the day of the month and the day of the week. Because either that Monday was the 2nd of the month or the 3rd of the month. So they both agree that the murder took place on Monday, but one of them says it was on the 3rd of the month. So we have a right to assume that that Monday that he testifies on the murder was really the 2nd of the month. He's claiming it's the 3rd of the month because he doesn't realize the Ibur. He's not aware of that Ibur. And we're going to assume that his mistake is based on the fact that most people don't know about the day of the Ibur. So the murder didn't take place on the 3rd of the month, as he said, but rather on the 2nd of the month, which was a Monday. He said it's the 3rd of the month, he wasn't aware of the Ibur. So why is that a better proof for Ravina than the Gemara in Chulin? The Ran says that the Gemara in Chulin is no proof because there we would undermine the entire parasha of Ritzicha. Here, in this case, we could have the parasha of Ritzicha if they both said it was on the same day of the month. And yet, even if there's a discrepancy of one day of the month, we're still going to put the accused to death. And we're going to reconcile the two Eidim based on Rov. And so too in a Ben Soromora, we're going to put him to death beyond 2 1/3 months, up to 3 months, because of the Rov. That's Ravina's proof. So again, we don't know what Ravina is thinking about Vitzilu ha'eda. Vitzilu ha'eda is not telling me to be choshish for the miut. So what exactly is the thrust of Vitzilu ha'eda? I guess Ravina is going to say that Vitzilu ha'eda refers to the nuances of the Maisa Vera, meaning, let's say they both testify that Reuven murdered Shimon, but it could be that Reuven murdered Shimon inadvertently, unintentionally, as a shogeg. And even if the Rov indicates that he was amazing, we would still be choshish for miut, maybe he was not amazing. That's Vitzilu ha'eda. No. All right, so let's take a break here for today, and we'll see more of this sugya b'lineda tomorrow. Let's make a note of where we got up to. The Isak Adai Shalom Amrin and Zil Basaruba Nema Hani Dafka Kamasad Vakushu the Kamachashe Ela Mishum Damrinon Zil Basaruba Ruben Inshi Avdi the Tobi Bura the Yarcha. We got up to Omar Yirmiyah Midifki. Okay then? All right, have a great day. Thank you so much.